maybe there are no objective moral values and duties. Maybe it's just subjective and we just assume it is. They're lying to themselves and everyone. The only people they're convincing is themselves and the choir they're preaching to. No one buys that nonsense. Everyone is biased. God is angry in one book, or happy in one book, or merciful in one book, or judging in another book. The Bible was not given to individuals. The Bible was given to the church. Is Christmas biblical? What do we mean by biblical? Do we mean is it in the Bible? No. There similarities between Jesus and other gods.
Welcome to Biblical Dhiman, and today our guest is Michael Jones, who is the founder and director of the non-profit organization Inspiring Philosophy, and is primarily dedicated to research in the fields of philosophy, history, and science to uncover deep philosophical questions relating to the universe and our individual perception of life. He has a master's in philosophy from the University of Arizona and has published a plethora of research work on his YouTube channel called Inspiring Philosophy. It's a joy to be here with you, brother.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Okay, so let's begin with your journey that how did you come to know Jesus Christ?
Yeah, I was raised in a Christian background, but I was very rebellious. So I became a deist for a while, like in high school, kind of like a like agnostic kind of person, I guess you could say. Slowly but surely, after talking with a lot of people, I slowly became a Christian. One of the reasons was I dealt with kids I knew that were Jesus mythicists and were saying all sorts of weird stuff that I just knew from my own research was nonsense. So I was like, That's just this crap." And so at the time, I thought like the arguments against Christianity were pretty bad. So I tried to research it for myself. I tried to research evidence for Christianity. And slowly but surely, I started to accept the evidence for the resurrection and the reliability of the New Testament was pretty good. And I slowly became a Christian. It took time. I'm not sure if there was ever really a point. It was just a slow process for me.
Wow, praise God. So you did your own research to find Christianity reliable or Gospels reliable, or it's just through the conversation that happened?
No, it was a lot of research. I read a lot. I've always been a reader. So it slowly but surely took me there.
So what was your age?
I don't know if it was a specific age. It was throughout high school. So like probably between the ages of like 14 and like 20. I mean, it's hard to really say.
Well, that's great. That's great. According to you, what is the best argument for the existence of God?
Oh, I think the best way to go is through forms of contingency arguments. So when you look at what the universe is and where it came from, these are very, very hard to justify on a non-theistic worldview. So you start with trying to think, well, what is the universe made of? And people will typically say particles. Well, if you look at the research in quantum field theory, they would say particles aren't like really little balls of matter. They're blips in like quantum fields. So then you need to ask, what are quantum fields? And people will say, well, we don't know. A lot of researchers would say quantum fields are not anything. They're not a substance. They're just information. They're just structures. This is where you get research from those like Minor Kuhlman, for example. They'll say things like, well, we can't really talk about a substance when it comes to quantum field theory. You can only talk about the information of quantum fields or particles. Well, then you need to ask if reality is just information, what is that information contingent on, or what made that information? It makes far more logical sense that a mind would create the construct of reality than it just coming from nothing or just always existing or just coming from some underlying substance that is non sentient. It just seems irrational, kind of like a logical leap. It seems more parsimonious or simpler to just say, yeah, it's far more likely the reality that we live in, the information of this reality came from a mind. And that to me just seems more of a reasonable conclusion than saying all this came into existence from some non sentient substance by accident or processes that are not controlled by anything, but it just have always been there. There's a lot of problems with trying to get around a theistic foundation.
Absolutely. So have you ever been encountered some atheists, those who have argued against contingency argument?
Yeah, you'll get definitely some views, people arguing from the work of that like Graham Oppy, for example. But I think if you read philosophers like Richard Swinburne, Josh Rasmussen, there's a lot of pushback on that. I firmly don't think that Oppy's construction or worldview is really as coherent as something you're going to get from Swinburne. Again, and there's a lot of complexity in these views. I'm giving a very brief overview, but generally, when you look at it, again, it goes back to the idea: uh, are we really going to posit that all of reality, the complexity that we have, came from some non-sentient substance? Now, let's say that maybe you're debating with an atheist, and they go, "Well, I'm convinced of that." Okay, so let's just set the contingency argument to the side for a minute. Then you also have to explain how this non-sentient substance not only created all of reality, but beings that are conscious. You got to get around the hard problem of consciousness. Then you got to explain why there are objective moral values and duties. So not only is consciousness created, but also there are moral values and duties which exist for conscious beings. Then you need to explain why there is fine tuning as well. Uh, when you look at all that data, they may come up with like for consciousness, well, maybe consciousness came about from some unknown physical processes by accident. Maybe there are no objective moral values and duties. Maybe it's just subjective and we just assume it is. But you see the problem with what's happening here. They're positing multiple explanations for each thing. So for what created reality, they have to come up with some non-sentient substance that somehow is able to generate all of reality. For consciousness, they have to come up with some physical process in that entire worldview that somehow created consciousness. For moral values and duties, they have to posit another meta-ethical theory. For fine tuning, they have to come up with another explanation for that. Do you see the problem? They're multiplying explanations. They have to come up with all these different explanations, whereas theists can explain all of that data, contingency, consciousness, fine tuning, moral values and duties, with one sweeping explanation, namely that a God exists and created reality. He would be the fundamental source of consciousness, moral values and duties, all of reality, fine tuning. It explains all of the data with one sweeping explanation. Whereas non-theistic worldviews have to come up with different individual explanations to account for all this data. By definition, that is ad hoc. Or a violation of Occam's razor. You have come up with multiple explanations that you don't need because we can explain all this data with one very simple explanation, namely that a God exists.
Absolutely, I totally agree with you. So, in many of the atheists say they are not biased, and we when we hear their arguments, so what is your say when atheists say they are not biased?
They're lying to themselves and everyone. The only people they're convincing is themselves and the choir they're preaching to. No one buys that nonsense. Everyone is biased. Anytime you take a view and publicly try to, if you publicly proclaim a view, there are parts of your brain connect that to your very identity because that's how you're now known to the public. You've espoused these views and now you're defending them. That then connects to your identity. So you will defend it in the same way you're defending your own identity. Everyone's going to be biased towards views they have. That's just the way human nature is. And research has shown that in academia, there is anti-Christian bias. You can look up the research of like those like George Yancey or see a video I made, Are Christian Scholars Bias, where I compiled a lot of that data. Uh, so there is a lot of anti-Christian bias in academia, and a lot of people want to appease who we would call the experts in academia, and so they're going to gravitate towards views that are going to make them look good among those experts in academia, which is going to be anti-Christian or more liberal, moving away from Christianity stuff. And this is not me saying this. This is the research I've cited, which has found evidence of anti-Christian bias. So there is definitely going to be bias against Christian ideas, any evidence that confirms a Christian worldview. That's just the way the world works now. So anyone who says they're not biased is lying to you, and they're not really in touch with a lot of the research, which has found anti-Christian bias in academia.
Absolutely. So atheists are biased too. I watched one video of a Bible scholar, Dan
Hmm.
McLennan, and a YouTube short where he titled the video a short like this: "There is no God of the Bible," and he quotes.
There is no God of the Bible. And I don't mean that in some kind of edgelord, all gods are fairy tales way. I mean it in the sense that the Bible does not present a single depiction of God. It presents numerous different and frequently contradictory depictions of God. And so you can't just add them all together and look at the sum and have a fuller picture of God. You just get a tangled, paradoxical mess. What you do to get a notion of the God of the Bible is negotiate with the text and center and prioritize certain depictions and then marginalize, reinterpret, or outright ignore other depictions. And all of this is in the interest of making the text more meaningful or more useful for us within a given context or situation, which means any God of the Bible that we find is a situationally emergent, negotiated, divine profile, because the Bible is not univocal, it does not speak with a single unified voice, and it does not present a single unified idea of God.
So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's nonsense. For one thing, it's presupposing a sort of very, very simple psychology of a being. He can only act this certain way or only be this certain way. And that's nonsense. If you were to look at, this conversation we're having now and compare it to like the text messages I have with my sister, you may not even think we're the same person because the way I'm going to talk to her is different than I'm going to talk to you. It's also different than how I'm going to talk to my wife or how I'm going to talk to my daughter who's still a child. You're going to get very different pictures with who I'm communicating with or how I'm communicating. You're going to get very different pictures based on the mood I'm in. If I didn't eat today, you're going to get different psychology than if I was having a good day. That's just the way it is. And God is also a being. He experiences all sorts of different emotions. He's going to interact with different people in different ways, different circumstances. Like take Jesus for example, in the Gospel of John when he's going to resurrect Lazarus. Uh, he shows up and Martha gets a sermon, but Mary gets tears. Okay, the way he deals with Thomas is different than how he deals with Peter. Okay, why? Because Jesus knows people come in all shapes and sizes. They have different psychology. Everyone needs something different. So he's going to respond to people differently depending on where they are, what their psychology is, and what they need. So, let's just take Dan's view that Jesus isn't God. Okay, so I disagree, but God is going to have a very similar way of doing that. If he's omniscient or at least incredibly far more intelligent than us, he's going to understand that the way he's going to interact with Moses is going to be different than how he's going to interact with Elijah or Jonah or the people of Nineveh or the people of Israel, because there's different psychologies there. There's different circumstances there. God himself has his own psychology, I guess we could say, in a non-mental way, I guess. So, uh, in that regards, we would expect a God to be very multi dimensional in his personality here. We just can't expect, oh, yes, God is this uniform, bland, boring substance that only responds in one way to everything. That's just not compatible with what we would expect from psychology. So they may say, well, you're positing a very complex explanation versus Dan's very simple one. Well, it's not about that. It's about parsimony. It's about positing the simplest explanation that can explain all the data. And I just think when you calculate in the various circumstances that God is interacting with, the various human psychologies God is interacting with, God's only multidimensional psychology, which experiences a range of emotions from anger to sadness to joy, you're going to get a multivariable, you're going to get various ways that God can interact and respond. So just assume that God is angry in one book or happy in one book or merciful in one book or judging in another book doesn't mean we're dealing with contradictory accounts of God. We're dealing with a multidimensional God, like any person would be. I don't understand this logic and why they think that's the way to go. You got to calculate in other things like psychology, like emotions, like circumstances, like metaethics and normative ethics. These are all relevant. So we just can't assume a being like God is one dimensional in his personality, which I feel like this objection is doing. And that's problematic. Now, if Dan wanted to bring up some specific passages, we could talk about that. But again, I would just probably use a lot of the same reasoning here. The way he's going to respond to David is not going to be the same way he's going to respond to Paul. The way he's going to respond to Paul is not the same way he's going to respond to Adam and Eve or Moses. Okay. He's dealing with all these various different people who have different psychologies, different vices, different virtues, it's going to be different, and that's what we should expect. Like we would expect any parent who's got multiple kids understands their kids need different things. Okay, maybe kid one needs more push. Maybe kid two needs more compassion. Maybe kid three needs more of a lecture. You know, this parents understand that kind of stuff. God as our parent or as our heavenly Father would understand that as well.
So I totally agree with you that God is a God of multidimensional. He talks to people at different times, different situations, and through different mediums. And in the Old Testament, he donkey spoke up, and in the Old Testament, when we read the donkey spoke up. So Christians also believe that God has a different characters or different personalities. In the Old Testament, he's very angry. In the New Testament, he's very gracious. So,
Well,
but
that's not entirely
actually,
true. I mean, that's not
yeah.
entirely. Look at Jonah, the book of Jonah. He's very merciful to Nineveh, but then go to Acts. He's not merciful to Ananias and his wife because they were hiding money from the church. I think we have the same God. Just again, he's going to respond to people differently depending on circumstances and where they're at.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. So as we are coming towards the Christmas 25th of December, so many Christians, there are 45,000 plus Christian denominations on earth. So few of them says, no, Christmas is not biblical. Jesus was not born on 25th of December. So what are your thoughts? Is Christmas biblical?
Yeah, well, first, there aren't 45,000 denominations. That's people getting really nitpicky. Like they'll separate like the United Methodist Church and uh like uh like the Second United Methodist Church. They'll separate like different Presbyterian groups. There really aren't that many. There's just different churches of various denominations. Like like if you go through that list, they'll separate like the Presbyterians of Britain and the Presbyterians of the United States. It's like, come on, like they're both Presbyterian. We're being really nitpicky here. So I don't I every time I hear that, I'm always like, that's not really accurate. We're just like you're basically accounting the amount of church organizations, not denominations, and that's different. That churches are a subgroup of denominations. You can have various Presbyterian churches, but they're all Presbyterian, for example, or Lutheran, or you get the idea. But when it comes to Christmas itself, is Christmas biblical? What do we mean by biblical? Do we mean is it in the Bible? No, but the foundation for it is because the Christmas is the celebration of the incarnation, and everything there is told about. We're told about, so we can celebrate it. Is Christmas biblical in the sense that it aligns with biblical principles? Yes, then it is biblical. If that's what you mean by biblical. There's nothing wrong about celebrating Christmas. There's nothing sinful about it, or nothing about it that goes against the Bible. It's Christians want to honor the incarnation. We've established a holiday that does. And if that's what you mean by biblical, then yes, it is biblical. But is it in the Bible? No, it's not in the Bible, and no one claims it is. But there's nothing pagan about Christmas, which people often assume. There's absolutely nothing. The date of Christmas was chosen because early Christians believed that Jesus would have to die on the same day he was conceived. Now, I don't hold to that belief, but early Christians did. They believed that Jesus died on March 25th by their own calculations. So just count forward 9 months, you get December 25th. That's why they chose that date. We have no evidence of any pagan holiday on that date prior to 354 AD. That's after Constantine lived and died. So it's far more likely, in my view, that pagans moved a pagan holiday to December 25th after the rise of Christianity under Emperor Constantine. We can look back in the historical records and see that during the time of Constantine, Emperor Licinius worshipped the sun in November. Prior to that, Emperor Aurelian worshipped the sun with chariot races every 4 years. Saturnalia was never on December 25th. It was on the 17th and may have lasted for 3, 5, 7 days, but never on the 25th. We have no evidence of any winter solstice holiday on December 25th. So all of a sudden, after Constantine, you get a bunch of pagan holidays on that date. Well, what's more likely? Well, it's more likely that pagans moved a holiday on that date to compete with Christmas because under Constantine, Christianity got power, so pagans wanted to compete with it. Again, you go back prior to Constantine, complete silence. After Constantine, you get an explosion of pagan holidays. It's a weird coincidence there, in my view. I think it's more likely pagans moved a holiday to that date. So there's that. And none of the Christmas customs we have go back to paganism. Decorating pine trees is a European folk custom that came about from in Alsace, France in the 1400s or so. Any other pay any I've looked at all the other Christmas customs, none of them go back to paganism.
Absolutely. That's a very insightful information that paganism, the pagans started they started celebrating 25th December after the reign of Emperor Constantine. And and also you mentioned that Christmas is definitely is not mentioned in the Bible, but it has a foundation in the Bible, like the birth of Jesus and the three wise men are coming from the three wise men are coming to give gifts to the Jesus. So as we hear about Jesus and there the story develops, right? There's skeptics who says that Jesus is a man-made god or just like any other god. So what are your thoughts when people compare Jesus versus when we say that Jesus versus different gods or Jesus versus other gods?
Yeah, that's not accurate. I mean, like, so there similarities between Jesus and other gods? Well, of course there are. Of course there are similarities. Jesus does miracles. Other gods did miracles. I mean, you're gonna find similarities there because that's just what's going to happen. So, but are any of the similarities anything specific? No, there's nothing really there that you can use to say that, oh yeah, that we can clearly see a pretty strong similarity here between Jesus and this other God. That simply doesn't happen. What we have is we have vague miracle associations. Like people will bring up Asclepius, like he's a healing god from ancient Greece. Well, they'll say, well, he healed a blind man. Well, the difference is Jesus heals blind men while he's walking around in Judea, uh, Galilee. Okay, that's not the same thing because the healing of Asclepius happens in his temple after he is deified and made a god. People went through the inscriptions there and they thought, oh, look, we found one of many different types of healings, and this one happens to be healing a blind man. Therefore, there's a similarity here. Well, no, you've cherry picked out of these multiple healings, like people being healed of just all sorts of random stuff that Jesus doesn't do. You cherry picked out the blind one. You said, oh, there's a similarity here. Well, no, look at the context. So if you want to show there's a similarity, you need to show that it is actually specific. Like some guy walks into a wedding at Cana and there are big jugs there of water used for purification, and he turns it into wine. Did Dionysius do that? Did Horace do that? No. So you need to have something specific like that. We don't have anything like that. So you got to find something so specific that it cannot be anything other than just coming about by coincidence. Because given the vast amount of stories that humans have come up with, the vast amount of events in history, you're going to have similarity if you look hard enough. I mean, that's just the way it works. People do this all the time with like, they'll look at American presidents like John F. Kennedy, and they'll look at American president like Abraham Lincoln, and they'll go, they were both assassinated. They were shot in the back of the head. There's these entire lists that show the similarities. Like JFK was in the back of a Lincoln, and Abraham Lincoln was in Kennedy Theater, and they'll go, "Oh, look at all the similarities." Like you can find similarities if you look hard enough, but you need to show something actually is specific. And when people bring up other gods, it's never anything specific. It's just vague similarities, or they comes from texts that post-date the New Testament, and it's like that doesn't work. You can't use texts that post-date the New Testament to try to say Christians copied or adapted from them.
Such claims like Jesus was copied from different myths or different books or different religion, it isn't true because there are no specific similarities between Jesus and other gods, right?
Yeah, there's nothing there that would make you think, oh yes, there's clearly enough here to think there's copying going on. I mean, if you want to look at something that's actually like copying, look at like the way the Romans used Greek mythology and then just, Latinized everything. I mean, it's very clear they're just taking the old Greek stories and adapting it for their Roman mythology. There you go. There's a very clear way this sort of happens. I mean, or you can see like various later Christian texts and the way they sort of rework New Testament things, like Empress Eudocia, like reworking the story of Jesus into her poetic work. I mean, there's clearly a case there where they're clearly adapting and copying. But when you can only just find vague similarities, you're making a huge logical leap. You need something that's pretty explicit.
So moving on to the next question, that many Christians find reading Bible very boring, or sometimes they find text out of out of context, or they find outdated. So how do you what advice would you give to the young Christians, especially when they struggle reading the Bible?
Yeah, I mean, I would say read a lot of commentaries, get a good study Bible. You got to rely on experts here. The Bible was not given to individuals. The Bible was given to the church to evangelize. So it should be interpreted with what the church was taught. So this is why reading early church fathers is important because they were trained by the apostles, like Ignatius and Polycarp, and then they trained the next generation. We need to go back and see what they said as well to help us better understand these texts, but also read what scholarly experts have to say. I mean, you cannot read this stuff in isolation. You talk to a pastor or a priest, get information from them because they were trained by the church to hand down the correct understanding and the correct interpretation. That goes back to the apostles. Now, are they perfect? No, but that's why we look at other things. We read church fathers, we read different commentaries to make sure we're getting this right. You cannot read the Bible in isolation.
So you need people to help you to read the Bible. As it's like in the book of Acts, the Ethiopian eunuch was reading the book of, I think, Isaiah, and that guy, I forgot the name. He goes there and he interprets the text, and the Ethiopian eunuch says, "How would I know until someone interprets me or makes me understand the text?" So,
Hmm.
is there any particular commentary or study Bible would you recommend to the um, you viewers?
I mean, a good NASB or ESV study Bible is pretty good. I would say start there.
Great. Thank you, brother, once again for giving your time. And it was
Hmm.
really a pleasure to have you here. And I hope people gonna be blessed after watching this.
But yeah, I appreciate you having me.